Welcome back to the Question Table, a podcast of the Way Home Ministries. I'm your host, Sylvia Geronimo. Today and for the next 2 weeks, we are going to do something a little different. We are going to have a two-part conversation around a single question. I have been spending the last month with King David and reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel. I guess I was inspired by the streaming series The House of David on Amazon Prime, and then I watched the animated movie on Apple TV, and I found that they were both fabulous productions. But I wanted to do a deep dive into the life of David and his story, but allow Scripture to have the last word, and not the streaming service. And at the end of his story, I have this question that rose. What unfinished story is God asking me to face? So I ask you, what unfinished story is God asking you to face? I have found that there are seasons in life when something just feels off and I can't name it. I know my bills are paid, my relationships look fine on the surface, my calendar is well balanced, and yet I just feel that there's like a quiet famine underneath everything. My energy feels low and my joy feels thin, and then my prayer starts feeling dry. And so I found that David went through the same thing. When I came across his story in 2 Samuel chapter 21, I find myself asking, it looks like nothing is growing here. I wonder if David felt the same. And he must have, because in this particular chapter opens up with a 3-year famine in Israel. And this wasn't just a bad week that they were having or a rough season. This had been 3 long years of scarcity where the crops were failing and the people were becoming anxious and all the leaders were being pressured, including King David. And what I love about David here is that I don't see him trying to immediately fix things. As before, when he went into battle, he would hold a strategy meeting, but not this time. And he doesn't blame the weather. He decides to stop and ask the Lord. He inquires, and then he listens. And God's answer is surprising, and it feels like it comes out of nowhere. God says that the famine isn't about rain or about soil, it isn't about the weather, it's about history. God tells David that the land is suffering because King Saul, the king before David, had broken a covenant with a people group called the Gibeonites. When Saul was king, in his zeal, he had tried to wipe out a people that Israel had promised to protect generations earlier during the leadership of Joshua. And this is where theology became uncomfortable for me, because it tells me something that I don't always want to hear, that sometimes the present is heavy because the past has never been dealt with or healed. Don't we often assume that our problems started last week or last year or maybe even in our childhood? But this piece of scripture suggests something deeper, that communities and families and even nations can carry unresolved stories forward until they are finally faced. So, my friend, I invite you to think about your life for a moment. Have you ever reacted strongly to something small and later realized it wasn't about that moment at all? It was about something old, something that was unfinished, something that never got named. You see, that is what is happening here in Israel. The land is dry because the story is broken. So next we read that David calls the Gibeonites and he asks them, what do they want? And we don't see that these people ask for money and they don't ask for land. What they ask for is justice. And it is a hard justice. It made me pause, and I'm sure it'll make you too. When you read this chapter, we see that the Gibeonites ask for the lives of 7 men of Saul's house. They want the wrong acknowledged and addressed. And then we see that 7 men are chosen, and these 7 men die. And at first it feels like revenge. But it's actually a restoration of the moral order. King Saul's house had tried to erase them, and now the truth is being seen and has to be faced. And there's a cost. And I'm not sure if our modern life really connects here, but I know that we live in a culture that wants fast solutions to slow problems. We do want to skip the uncomfortable conversations, and we don't like the apology or the grief or even the repair. We want to go straight to relief. But God keeps saying through Scripture, you can't heal what you won't name. In society, it looks like all the isms that keep us in the bondage of violence and suspicion. In families, it looks like generational patterns of dysfunction and pain. In churches, it looks like wounds that never got discussed. And in marriages, it looks like years of silence. But in our hearts, it looks like addictions we manage instead of healing. In this story, King David shows us something else that is very important, is that leadership means going backwards before you start going forward. He doesn't say, that was King Saul, not me. He takes responsibility for the people he's leading. And that's rare, because it's easy to say, that wasn't my fault and that isn't my problem. But David says, if the land is hurting, then I need to understand why. That's humility. Can we do the same thing in our lives? Can we pay attention and wonder, why is it that we are tired or numb? Why is it that this particular relationship with this particular person or this particular type always feels strained? Because usually we search forward for answers when God might be gently asking us to look backward with compassion. This part of the story invites us into curiosity instead of controlling. And David doesn't rush, he inquires. And inquiry is a spiritual posture because it says, God, show me what I cannot see. So this is the first part of the story, and it returns us to the question which we asked at the beginning of the chapter. What unresolved story might still be shaping the season that you are living in now? Because sometimes famine isn't punishment. It's an invitation to go deeper and look closer. And before we move forward, let's briefly remember where we have been. In part 1, at the beginning of the story, we saw Israel living in famine for 3 years. David doesn't panic. He decides to inquire of the Lord. And when he does, God reveals the cause. It was King Saul who had broken a covenant with the Gibeonites long ago. So the present is dry because the past was never repaired. And we all learned that healing often requires us to look backwards with courage and honesty, not just with strategy. And when we look back, it will cost us something. Part 2 then takes us deeper into the human heart of the story. Justice is carried out, and it is a hard justice. I found myself reading those verses over and over again because I was not expecting that. And then we come face to face with a woman named Rizpah. She enters the narrative because she's the mother of the 2 men who were executed. She lost 2 sons. And we see that this mother does not disappear quietly in the background of the story. She actually comes to the forefront of the story, and in that story, she stays put. She camps beside the bodies of her 2 sons, and she keeps her animals away, and she refuses to let her sons be forgotten or discarded. It's one of the most tender moments in the Old Testament because here there are no speeches, there's no miracles, there's just the presence of a grieving mother. Rizpah teaches us something theology books rarely talk about, even sermons on a Sunday morning rarely address, is that grief itself can be holy work. We don't see a mother trying to fix the situation, she can't. And we don't see a woman trying to argue theology, it's pointless. She simply stays with her love. And her posture moves a king. When King David hears what Rizpah is doing, he gathers the bones of Saul and Jonathan and her 2 sons and the other 5 men who died, and he gives them a proper burial. He restores dignity to a broken story. And it is only after that that Scripture says that God answers the prayer for the land. Friends, that matters. The famine doesn't end when punishment happens. It ends when honor and memory are restored. When story is given the dignity it's due. Again, this might not resonate with our present story, but in modern life, we often rush past grief. We say things like, be strong, or it's time to move on, or don't dwell on the past. But Rizpah shows us something wiser, is that healing comes when we stay long enough for truth and tenderness to meet. So, behind this question, I invite you to think about the spaces in your life where grief was hurried. Maybe through a divorce that you just wanted it to be over, but you never grieved it. Maybe a move you were forced to make, and you still long for that place that you left. Or maybe it was the death of a loved one. It's okay to go back and grieve. Maybe it's just a season of change that is hard, and everyone keeps telling you that you need to move on and embrace what is now. But maybe you just need to stop. Sometimes our land stays dry because we never paused to mourn what was lost. A king listens to a grieving mother. He lets her courage shape his leadership, and that's another powerful lesson here, is that leaders, parents, friends, even our spiritual guides are not meant to have all the answers, but they help us to stay open and be changed by compassion. And then we come to a quiet ending to this very hard chapter, is that we read that the famine does lift. And it's not because everything is suddenly perfect and not because the story turns pretty, but because truth and justice and grief and mercy finally share the same space. That's what makes it beautiful and holy and worthy to be paid attention to. Part 1 asks us to look backwards. Part 2 asks us to stay present, to sit with what hurts long enough for God to work through it. So it brings us to the deeper question behind this whole chapter of Part 1 and Part 2. Where might God be inviting you to honor and not hurry your unfinished story? Because sometimes the bravest faith is simply the faith that stays. Tune in for next week's 2-part episode as we will continue King David's story with another good question. I'll see you soon.